What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so it's been a while since we've done a character explanation. It's been a long time. Really, it's because I just kind of got burned out on it. We did those nonstop for like 2 years, and I was like, yeah, I'm ready to do something else besides just do character explanations all the time. It was driving me crazy. But Daredevil season 3 is coming out, and the main enemy of that season, of this coming season, is Bullseye. So I figured, why not do a character explanation on the character of Bullseye? Now, here's the thing, and this is one of those misconceptions that drives me up the wall. People always say that Bullseye made his appearance, or really made his debut in Marvel Comics back in 1976 with Daredevil 131. That's not true. He actually made his appearance back in 1969 with Nick Fury, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And that was a story by Gary Friedrich, Herb Trimpe, and Dick Ayers. Those of you guys who don't know who they are, not a great big huge deal, but there's a couple differences there. So the original version of Bullseye back in the old assassination of Nick Fury story, he was called Bullseye. So it wasn't like all one word. You had a hyphen in there. So it was B-U-L-L-S-I. And then he looked a little bit different. But aside from those things, he was still basically the same. He was a prodigious assassin. He was highly skilled in killing people. And so for the most part, everything was the same. But 7 years later in 1976, you ended up having Marv Wolfman, who rolled him over into the Daredevil comics. Now, the reason why was because back in 1964, when Daredevil first showed up, he was hugely popular because he was basically a street level character who was blind and who had enhanced senses through echolocation, things like that. And it struck a chord with readers for a momentary point in time. The issue was that Marvel in the 1960s was literally like a frantic madhouse of just introducing characters and teams. And so it was like, if you have an idea, put it on paper, we'll send it out. If we're not going to trust it with a solo series, we'll throw it in an anthology series and call it a day. And that was like all over the place. And so by the time you got to the early 1970s, even to the mid 1970s, characters who were street level, basically almost anyone except for like Spider-Man, weren't really interesting anymore. People had already picked their favorites. You had X-Men, which was regaining popularity because of Chris Claremont. You had Fantastic Four, which was already popular. The Avengers, you had Captain America because it's Captain America. And so they really kind of had their solid base of what Marvel knew would sell. And so the result was that Marvel wasn't really willing to cancel Daredevil so much as just like shift the writers around all the time. And so Marv Wolfman had come on board, and he actually wrote between issues like 125 and 139, I think it was. And then he wrote a couple issues in the 140s, and that was about it. But his idea was just tell different stories about Daredevil and see if there's a way to make it work. And so for the most part, it didn't work all that well. Bullseye was there, and his debut came in issues 131 and 132, or at least from Marv Wolfman anyway, came in issues 131 and 132. And all that you really find out about him is that he's just a really skilled assassin, and he challenges Daredevil to see whether or not he can defeat the guy and make a name for himself. Now, ultimately, he ends up getting defeated, but as a guy who managed to stand a pretty significant chance against Daredevil himself, he does pretty well. Now, this goes into his origin stories, which are pretty iffy. The most notable one comes with Bullseye Greatest Hits #1 back from 2004, and it's pretty straightforward. He's just basically a guy who's, at least he claims that his brother set fire to their home, and he made it out alive, but his dad died, and that kind of a thing. But then it's one of those things where they kind of pull a killing joke sort of situation where it's like, actually, none of it's true. And Bullseye is the one who says that it's not true at all. So there is no definitive origin for his character. It's just kind of a hodgepodge of different things. And you can take like the 3 or 4 origins that he has and take them for what they're worth. But after losing to Daredevil, but successfully holding his own, this eventually goes into his involvement with regards to really becoming more of like a Daredevil character. Now, this was not something that happened overnight, right? It wasn't as though he was introduced in 131 and then just went on to become a Daredevil mainstay. Instead, what you had issues 160 and 161, which were written by Roger McKenzie, and then you had issue 169, which was done by Dennis O'Neil. And those began to sort of segue Bullseye into more of like a mainstay for a Daredevil character. He wasn't by any means like a great big huge guy, but one of the notable things that he did, actually 2 great big huge things he did. The first one was in the Roger McKenzie run when he kidnapped Black Widow, and the second was in the Dennis O'Neil run when Dennis O'Neil came back and said, actually, the reason why Bullseye loves killing people is because he has a tumor, and he's basically psychotic because of his tumor. Now, the move with Black Widow was actually pretty well received, and it was a pretty cool thing because at the time, Black Widow was still being fleshed out in Marvel Comics. I mean, she originally appeared as a villain. Hawkeye had been tricked into becoming her aide, and then eventually he turned coded, became a good guy, and then eventually Black Widow became a good guy. But at the time, Marvel was still trying to like shuffle her around and figure out what they wanted to do. But there was enough fan interest there that the idea of Bullseye kidnapping Black Widow and then Daredevil having to rescue her and defeat Bullseye yet again was enough to pique interest, even if only a little bit. The idea of him having a tumor, and that's the reason why he's insane, insane. Bullseye fans hated that. They did not like the idea behind it because their whole concept was he really is just a crazy guy, but he's also just that good. Because what it did is it opened the door for the possibility that Marvel could reduce his ability to be accurate and then say, well, once he was cured of his tumor, he's not as accurate as he used to be, and fans were afraid Marvel would take certain liberties. Ultimately, they didn't. And this actually segued directly into Frank Miller's run. And that's the important thing here, is because when Dennis O'Neil was writing Daredevil, when Roger McKenzie was writing Daredevil, it was actually Frank Miller who was drawing it, or at least drew a few issues here and there. And so once Frank Miller took over as the actual writer, that changed everything. Because again, at the time, Daredevil was like, by that point in time when Frank Miller took over, Daredevil was struggling. I mean, you almost couldn't give his comics away because there's been a few interviews that people have done, and a lot of people have drawn the conclusion that at the end of the day, because of how his character was written, because of the narratives that were given, because of the direction of the art and so on, that really all Daredevil came down to was like a Spider-Man clone. And so the result was that people just kind of said, well, if I'm going to read Spider-Man, then I'll just go read Spider-Man. And so that, among other things, the fall of characters like Iron Fist and Luke Cage, they're dropping popularity. It was one of those things where street level characters are basically beginning to die out. And so enter Frank Miller. Now, Frank Miller's take on Daredevil, this is something a lot of people don't know. Frank Miller's take on Daredevil almost didn't happen. And the reason why was because where you had Roger McKenzie who was writing it at one point, and then you had Dennis O'Neil who was writing it at one point, with Frank Miller doing a lot of the artwork, he hated the scripts of Roger McKenzie. Like, he considered them to be absolutely terrible. And there was one point where he almost quit because the sales just weren't improving anymore. But eventually Dennis O'Neil went on to be went on to become editor-in-chief, or I think editor, but he went on to a higher ranking position within Marvel, and then actually appointed Frank Miller to become the writer for the stories. And so when that happened, everything shifted entirely, because now Frank Miller looked at Roger McKenzie's work and said, this is basically work going nowhere. If we're going to take street level superheroes or street level characters and we're going to make them characters that people like, then we have to start making them darker. We have to start giving people a reason to want to read them. And so Frank Miller basically took the entire concept of Daredevil and turned it on its head. Bullseye was part and parcel to that. And that's where people make the mistake. The whole idea of Bullseye killing Elektra was not rooted in making Bullseye more interesting. He was a means to an end. It was rooted in making Daredevil much, much darker. And so the way this played out originally was that along the line between Roger McKenzie and Dennis O'Neil's run, as well as a couple runs before theirs, especially in Marv Wolfman's, there came a point where Bullseye was basically a henchman working for Kingpin. Now, the issue with this was that he eventually ran into Daredevil, tried to implement a scheme, was busted, and sent to jail. And so what Frank Miller did is he used that as a way to not really write Bullseye out of the picture, but to replace him and then set up the means for Bullseye to make Daredevil a darker character. The way that this played out was that following the imprisonment of Bullseye, Elektra was introduced. Elektra had been introduced in 1981, and then she actually became a lover of Daredevil. And so the way that this played out was Bullseye had basically managed to escape prison after realizing that Elektra was the #1 assassin of Kingpin, and then in turn killed Elektra. But Kingpin actually ordered Bullseye to kill Daredevil if he was looking for a return to his position. And so in response to this, Bullseye actually tracked down, either Bullseye tracked down Daredevil or Daredevil tracked him down. I want to say Bullseye was the one who tracked down Daredevil, a fight initiated, and then Daredevil actually broke his back. He broke his spine, like shattered the whole thing. And so this allowed for Frank Miller to make Daredevil a lot darker and a lot more screwed up when it got to Daredevil 191, which is actually one of the most popular issues of his character. And the way that this played out, the way that this happened, is you ended up having Bullseye, who was recovering in a hospital from his injuries from Daredevil, when Daredevil broke in, brought a revolver, and then started playing a game of Russian roulette. It's actually one of the most dark moments for his character, and it's super twisted, but also super amazing. Because when Daredevil breaks in there and starts interrogating Bullseye, Bullseye thinks the gun's loaded, and Daredevil's just like, we're playing a game of Russian roulette, and that's just the way it goes. And it's kind of nuts. And so it was a little more than like Bullseye could handle. And the way that Frank Miller really kind of concluded this was intending to write Bullseye out, to basically say like that's the end of his character, or at least with regards to the Frank Miller run, because you don't really hear from Bullseye again after that. And so following this, you end up jumping into Daredevil Volume 2. Now, for the most part, you don't really see Bullseye that much in Daredevil Volume 2. He's just kind of there. He just like occasionally pops up. In reality, this really marked one of the not really as good as Frank Miller's, but like still one of the pretty solid runs that came with someone by the name of Ann Nesenti. Now, where Ann Nesenti's run was notable for introducing characters like Typhoid Mary, who's probably one of the most interesting of the Daredevil villains, her involvement with Bullseye was fairly limited in the sense that you had issues 284 to 291, I think it was, which actually had somewhat of an identity crisis, where you ended up having Daredevil who left, you had Bullseye who took up the Daredevil mantle and then started believing he was Daredevil, and then Daredevil took up the Bullseye mantle and the two of them fought, which kind of, brought Bullseye back to his senses, so to speak. But nonetheless, from there, it really just kind of picks up into him going out and just really sort of fluctuating around and free floating in the Marvel Comics universe. And the reason why I say that is because, again, outside of his involvement in the death of Elektra, Bullseye was just kind of a villain who was there, and nobody ever really knew what to do with him. And so when you go and look at like Chuck Dixon's Punisher run, for example, issues 101 through 102, he has a part in that story. You start going and looking at like future stories that are written later on down the line. You look at like Daredevil Volume 2, 48 through 49, which I think was written by Kevin Smith. He's just kind of there and just sort of free floating around and just does a few things here and there. He's contracted by like Mysterio, things like that, but nothing too significant. He just kind of occupies a place. And this really segues and goes all the way up to the events of Civil War when he finally gets a home, so to speak. And the reason for this was because during the events of Civil War, one of the things that Marvel had done, which was actually really interesting, was make a supervillain team, something akin to their own Suicide Squad, but not exactly. The way this played out was you had, of course, Tony Stark and Captain America, who were essentially fighting against one another, you know, kind of splitting the superhero community down the middle. But with regards to Iron Man, the entire superhero landscape was in shambles. You had the mighty Avengers, who existed to track down various superheroes, but then you also had their need to be able to access the criminal element of the Marvel Universe. And so what they did is they brought together a team called the Thunderbolts, which was led by Baron Helmut Zemo, the son of Baron Zemo, and then was basically filled with like your creme de la creme, so to speak, of like the various villains in Marvel, kind of like the unsellables, the ones who couldn't really hold a book and who were just kind of free floating out there and nobody really knew what to do with. I think Norman Osborn played a role, but the fact remains that you ended up having like the Thunderbolts going forward and like rounding up vigilante heroes and so on and so forth. The cool thing about this was that for the various scripts that were written with it, the various stories that were done really with the whole Thunderbolts concept, you ended up having like Warren Ellis and others who really kind of built on the idea that Bullseye was crazy, that Bullseye was absolutely bonkers, that he loved killing people, and used that as a means to kind of make his character a little more different. And what I mean by that is what they would do is they would have him continue to go on these missions with, you know, the Thunderbolts and so on and so forth, but he was always kind of treated like the Joker, like he was absolutely sadistic. If he was allowed to just go off on his own reins and do his own thing, he would kill everybody that he came across. And so they would basically keep him shackled up, shut away from everybody else. In addition to this, because Civil War went directly into the events of Secret Invasion, that's when you ended up seeing Bullseye along with a handful of others end up defeating, you know, some of the Skrulls and so on. But again, he's just kind of there. He's just kind of free floating. He plays these roles where he kind of spikes up and drops down and then spikes up and drops down, but that's about it. It was never one of those things where he ever achieved the same level of popularity or the same significance that he had during Frank Miller's run, at least not into the events of Dark Reign. Now, Dark Reign is when a lot of things shifted up for Bullseye and for a lot of the villains that were out there. And the reason for this is because going from Civil War to Secret Invasion to Dark Reign itself, what ended up happening here in this sort of really the middle road, the halfway marker of Joe Quesada's like reinvention of Marvel Comics, you ended up having Norman Osborn, who intervened information that would allow the superheroes to defeat the Skrulls and then passed it off as though it was his idea. That in turn led to the US government telling Tony Stark that he was ineffective as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. because he didn't know Secret Invasion was happening. They kicked him out, they replaced him with Norman Osborn, and Norman Osborn basically dismantled S.H.I.E.L.D., created Hammer, and then when almost all the superheroes evacuated, bailed out, and went underground, then that led directly into the Dark Avengers, and really like the Dark X-Men and Dark superhero teams. It was a way for Marvel to shift things up so that instead of having like your Avengers, your Mighty Avengers, your X-Men and so on and so forth, that you could have villains playing those characters. And so for Bullseye, he was shifted up and he became the character of Hawkeye. So he was kind of like the dark version of Hawkeye himself, which is kind of cool. I mean, he had run-ins with like the Sentry, like the stories themselves in terms of what they did were not that significant. The Dark Avengers had a couple good stories, but they would do things like fight nonsense stuff, robots and different things like that. And it was all right for what it was, but there did come a point, this is actually one of the coolest parts of the story, there did come a point in Deadpool Volume 3, issue number 12, where he actually faces off against Deadpool again. And the reason why that matters and the reason why it's kind of cool is because that actually shifts, it really kind of jumps back really to a story from, I want to say it was Deadpool Volume 1 with Joe Kelly, where you actually ended up finding out that Bullseye had adamantium laced to his bones by Lord Darkwind in order to be a more effective assassin, whatever the reason was. And of course, that's when he faced off against Deadpool at one point, but that kind of established the idea between these two stories. It laid out the idea that Bullseye and Deadpool had actually teamed up on a multitude of occasions back when Deadpool, before Joe Kelly took him over and he became comedic, back when Rob Liefeld was writing the stories, and Deadpool was like a straight up assassin, like a straight up killer for hire. The two of them would work together. They had been, teammates that were really allies for a little while and then eventually became enemies and so on and so forth. But things were just kind of shifting around. And that goes into things like Siege. It goes into Shadowland. It goes into like a lot of these stories and running all the way up until All New, All Different Marvel, when he basically ends up losing his eyesight from Daredevil, and he's just kind of trapped inside of his own body. But it's a cool situation because what it does is it allowed Marvel to kind of shift the character around and move him around, throw him in weird different positions and see if they would all work at the end of the day. But I would say, and this is one of the coolest things, for people who are Daredevil fans, and this is hopefully something we'll see in Daredevil Season 3, I would say that one of the most significant moments of Bullseye outside of him killing Elektra during Frank Miller's run came during the events of Shadowland. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Shadowland was a story where Daredevil was possessed by like the great beast of the Hand. And for those of you guys who don't know, the Hand is an organization that dates back decades. decades, thousands and thousands of years. And we don't need to go through the whole thing, but they well, really hundreds of years. They go back quite a ways. But there was one point in the very, very early days of humanity that the group that would later on become the Hand had worshipped this, demonic entity of sorts. And it was kind of like their god, so to speak. Well, eventually that god takes possession of Matt Murdock, who in turn takes control of the Hand. And so he's basically this villain sitting inside Shadowland in the middle of Hell's Kitchen, New York, and just like running this massive criminal empire. And so there comes a point when Bullseye basically travels to try to fight Daredevil and says, look, like, I want you. Like, I want to take you out. Daredevil comes out with a veritable army of the Hand, and Bullseye defeats them all and then goes on to fight Daredevil. Now, of course, he ends up getting beat by Daredevil because of all the advanced abilities he has because he's possessed, but successfully defeating multiple ninjas of the Hand. That was designed for the purpose of saying that, like, Bullseye is not just a guy who's there. He's a guy who's a legit, incredible threat. Because for those who have been reading Marvel Comics, the Hand are no joke. They are deadly as hell. If somebody contracts the Hand to come after you, then you better have your affairs in order. And that's just all there is to it. Unless you're Wolverine, Spider-Man, unless you're Spider-Woman, Jessica Drew, or like Morgan Le Fay, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop the Hand from getting to you. So successfully like defeating a few dozen of them by himself is no small feat. And that's one of the things that like a lot of Bullseye fans kind of champion as one of the great moments of his character when he was literally able to rip things apart. Now, again, it's kind of interesting to see what they're going to do with his character. It is Netflix, so it's going to be a lot more grounded than we're used to. It's not going to be as nearly as like far-flung and crazy, but I do think that we might see things like him defeating the Hand. Of course, we'll see him going toe-to-toe with Daredevil, and we'll certainly see like some pretty crazy stuff in terms of being super accurate with stuff. I wonder if we're going to see the one that we saw from like that terrible Ben Affleck Bullseye Daredevil movie from back in the day. Where Bullseye's introduced and he actually ends up throwing like, well, what is it he did? He threw paper clips into a guy's neck and killed him. I wonder if we're going to see stuff like that, because in the comics he's done crazy things like that. Like there was one point he threw a toothpick 100 yards and killed a guy. Like, I mean, it's nuts the kind of stuff that this guy can do, and it's absolutely bonkers. There was one point where I'm pretty sure he threw a paper airplane with such incredible accuracy that like it flew all the way to another building on like the other side of, not really the other side of town, but like a pretty good distance. Like it's pretty crazy in terms of the kind of stuff he's able to do. It's a little bonkers in terms of the stuff that he can pull off. But nonetheless, I'm curious to see what we're gonna get. I'm curious to see how the whole thing's gonna unfold. And I'm pretty excited about it. But yeah, with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.